Kai Sullivan had always been the kind of person who preferred the quiet hum of machinery over human interaction. As a skilled engineer aboard the military ship Aegis, he found comfort in his work. The ship was his world, a place where he could escape the chaos of social expectations. His hands were constantly busy with repairing the ship's systems, tweaking the propulsion units, and making sure everything ran smoothly. He wasn't the one to seek out attention or company. He kept to himself, focusing on the job at hand. But one afternoon, everything changed. Kai sat at his workbench, eyes glued to a holographic schematic of the ship's failing reactor core, when his communicator beeped, breaking his concentration. With a sigh, he tapped the device, and a stern voice echoed from the other end. "Engineer Sullivan, report to Commander Valora Nethys immediately. It's urgent." Valora Nethys, the commander of Aegis, was known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense attitude. Kai had worked with her before, though their interactions were minimal. She was strict but fair, always getting to the point. Her orders were law, and you didn't question them. "Understood," Kai muttered to himself, pushing himself away from the console. He didn't know what the urgency was, but he had learned not to question the commander. As Kai made his way to the briefing room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air aboard Aegis had been thick with rumors recently. Whispers about a new assignment, something involving an alien officer. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but he had no time to dwell on the thoughts as he reached the door. Commander Valora was waiting inside, but there was someone else with her. A woman? No, a figure. Kai's mind struggled to process the sight in front of him. The alien standing there was stunning, impossible to ignore. She had skin the color of deep jade, eyes that gleamed with a red intensity, and sharp features that gave her an air of both elegance and danger. Her name, as the commander quickly introduced, was Zarian Drax. Kai's jaw tightened involuntarily. Zarian was known for her beauty, yes, but it was the dangerous reputation of her people that always overshadowed it. The Drax, an alien race that commanded the respect of everyone who crossed their path. It was said they were deadly in combat, cunning, and manipulative. And now, Zarian was being assigned to him. They would share quarters aboard the Aegis for the duration of their mission. "Engineer Sullivan, meet Officer Zarian Drax," Commander Valora said, her tone stern but with a hint of something else. "You two will be working closely together. You will share quarters, collaborate on repairs, and assist each other. This is a top priority assignment. I expect nothing less than full cooperation." Kai stood there, his mind racing. The last thing he wanted was to be in close quarters with someone like Zarian. He had always preferred his solitude, and now he was expected to live with an alien seductress who could easily manipulate anyone with a glance. Zarian turned to him, her gaze cool and calculated. "I look forward to our time together, Engineer Sullivan," she said with a soft smile, but there was a dangerous glint in her eyes. Kai couldn't tell if she was mocking him or simply being polite. Either way, he wasn't thrilled about what was to come. The Aegis had just become a far more complicated place. The next few hours were a blur for Kai Sullivan. He had barely had time to process his new living arrangement before he was summoned to meet Zarian Drax again. This time, it wasn't in a formal briefing room, but in the shared quarters where they would both be staying. The Aegis was a massive ship, but every space was meticulously planned, and this room was no exception. It was sleek, functional, and cold, much like everything else on the ship. Still, as Kai stepped inside, the weight of the situation hit him. He was about to live in the same space as an alien officer who could make even the most composed men lose their focus. Zarian was already there, standing by the window, her sharp eyes studying the stars outside. Her appearance was breathtaking in its own way. Her skin glowed in the dim light, a deep green that seemed almost luminous. Her long black hair fell gracefully down her back, contrasting sharply with the bold crimson hue of her eyes. Kai couldn't help but notice the effortless elegance in her every movement. She exuded a confidence that was both intimidating and fascinating. Despite the allure that radiated from her, Kai wasn't easily swayed. He had grown up around strong personalities, had seen his fair share of charming and dangerous individuals, and had learned not to get caught up in appearances. Still, there was something about Zarian that was hard to ignore. "Nice of you to join me," Zarian said, her voice smooth, like honey poured over steel. Her tone was casual, but there was a challenge in it, one Kai couldn't quite place. She turned to face him, her red eyes locking with his. "I thought you might be one to keep to yourself, but we'll have to get along if we're going to make this work." Kai crossed his arms, trying to keep his cool. He wasn't about to let her intimidate him. "I'm here to do my job. Nothing more." Zarian smiled, but there was something knowing in her gaze, as if she saw right through him. "That's the spirit," she replied, her lips curving upward. "Though, I have to admit, I'm not sure what we're supposed to do now. It's not every day you're assigned to share quarters with someone of my caliber." Kai stiffened, his instincts telling him to be cautious. "I'm not interested in your caliber." He was firm, his tone clear and resolute. "I don't need distractions, and I'm not here to entertain you." The room grew heavier with the tension between them. Zarian raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by his bluntness. "Oh, I'm sure you don't need distractions," she said, walking past him slowly. Her voice was soft, but there was a steel edge to it. "But we'll have to make this work, for both our sakes." Kai gritted his teeth, unsure of how to respond. This wasn't just about the mission. It was about surviving the next few weeks, or however long they were stuck together. There was something dangerous about Zarian. Something beyond her looks, beyond her calm demeanor. He could feel it, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Zarian paused, her back turned to him as she stared out into the vast emptiness of space. "I'm not going to bite, engineer," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. But Kai wasn't sure if she meant it or not. What he did know was that she wasn't going to make this easy, and that made him all the more determined to keep his distance. He let out a slow breath, trying to steady his nerves. "We'll see about that." The days that followed were a mix of strained silence and forced cooperation. Kai Sullivan spent most of his time in the Aegis engine room, working tirelessly to repair the ship's propulsion system. Zarian Drax, meanwhile, kept herself busy with her own duties, although Kai quickly realized they weren't nearly as complicated as his own. While he toiled away with mechanical schematics and faulty circuits, Zarian moved through the halls of the ship like she was floating, effortlessly commanding attention without saying a word. Kai had made it clear from the start that he wasn't interested in socializing, and Zarian, for her part, seemed to respect that, at least outwardly. However, when it came to the work they were assigned to do together, the tension was palpable. One morning, Kai was hunched over a console, his hands deep inside the guts of a malfunctioning reactor. The ship's systems had taken another hit during their recent skirmish, and it was up to him to make sure it didn't blow the ship to pieces. As he worked, he heard the soft click of boots behind him, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone clearing their throat. Kai sighed, not bothering to look up. "What is it now, Drax?" "I'm here to help." Zarian's voice chimed in, smooth as ever. She was standing just behind him, her presence felt even before he looked up. "Though I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. My expertise doesn't exactly involve engine repair." Kai grunted, wiping the sweat from his brow as he turned to face her. Zarian was standing there with a strange kind of grace, arms crossed, watching him work with an almost clinical interest. Her crimson eyes locked onto his, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. "You can stay out of the way," Kai replied, frustration seeping into his voice. He had never liked people hovering over him when he worked. He preferred to be left alone to focus. Zarian, on the other hand, didn't seem to take offense. Instead, she took a step closer, her gaze flicking over the complicated systems around them. "Not quite the response I was hoping for," Zarian said, a mischievous smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But if you insist, I suppose I'll just watch and learn." Kai scowled, his patience wearing thin. But he didn't say anything more. Instead, he returned to his work, fingers dancing over the control panel, adjusting the intricate wiring inside. Zarian, as promised, stepped aside. But her presence still lingered, and Kai couldn't help but notice her every move. Every time he needed a tool, she was there, her body just a little too close, her eyes never leaving his. It wasn't long before Kai felt himself growing increasingly distracted. He knew he couldn't afford mistakes, not with something as important as the Aegis engine on the line. But Zarian's calm demeanor, her unwavering gaze, and the occasional brush of her fingers against his as she passed him another tool kept pulling his attention away. "You know," Zarian said after a few moments, her voice low, almost thoughtful, "I don't usually have to ask for help. I'm used to being in control, doing things on my own." Kai finally glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "So why are you here then?" Her smile widened, and for the first time, there was a hint of something playful in her eyes. "Because I'm forced to be, just like you." That statement caught Kai off guard. For a moment, he simply stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Zarian was right. They were both stuck in this situation, whether they liked it or not. And if they were going to make it work, they'd have to get over their differences, no matter how difficult it seemed. With a deep sigh, Kai turned back to his work, trying to push aside the growing sense of irritation that bubbled inside him. They were stuck together, and whether he liked it or not, they'd have to learn how to coexist. Days turned into weeks, and Kai Sullivan and Zarian Drax's awkward coexistence began to settle into a strange routine. The tension that had initially filled the air whenever they were in the same room began to soften, but it didn't disappear entirely. They still avoided personal conversations, sticking mostly to discussions about the repairs they were working on and the ship's systems that needed attention. But one evening, after a particularly grueling day of work, things changed. Kai had stayed late in the engineering bay, trying to get ahead on some repairs. The ship's reactor was still unstable, and he was determined to fix it before it could cause any more trouble. His fingers ached from working too long, but he couldn't stop. There was too much at stake. Just as he was finishing a complicated diagnostic, he heard the soft, measured sound of footsteps approaching. He didn't look up. "I thought I'd find you here." Zarian's voice broke through the stillness, calm as always. "You're a workaholic, aren't you?" Kai sighed, not in the mood for another round of her teasing. "I'm just doing my job. Unlike some people, I don't have time for distractions." There was a brief silence before Zarian responded. "I'm not here to distract you, engineer. I wanted to talk. Really talk." Kai glanced up, surprised by the shift in her tone. Zarian wasn't the type to have heartfelt conversations, but tonight, her usual confident facade seemed to have cracked, just a little. She looked different, softer somehow, her eyes less calculating than they had been before. It was the first time he had seen her like this. Vulnerable, even. "About what?" Kai asked, genuinely curious but still cautious. It wasn't like Zarian to seek out personal conversations, let alone admit to being vulnerable. She stepped closer, her boots echoing softly on the metal floor, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world had quieted down. Her crimson eyes locked with his, and for the first time, she didn't seem like the alien seductress everyone feared. She was just a person, standing before him, her voice a little quieter than usual. "I'm not just here to be a soldier," Zarian began, her voice unexpectedly raw. "I was assigned to this ship because, well, my people are in crisis. A civil war, to be exact. And my role here is more than just tactical expertise. There's more at play than you know." Kai stood still, taking in her words. Zarian had always been so composed, so in control. He hadn't imagined her to be tied to such a personal struggle. "You don't have to explain yourself," Kai replied, though his tone softened. There was something different about Zarian now, something that made him want to listen. "I didn't think you were here by choice, but why tell me now?" Zarian took a deep breath. her shoulders dropping slightly. "Because I don't know who else to turn to," she said, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "I can't talk to my superiors about this, and the crew doesn't see me as anything but a weapon. But you see me differently, even if you don't want to admit it." Kay's mind raced, but he kept his expression neutral. He didn't know what to say. He had spent so much time thinking about how difficult this situation was, but now, looking at Zarian in this light, he realized he had underestimated her. She wasn't just the confident, dangerous officer. She was a person struggling with a war that threatened everything she knew. Zarian's gaze lingered on him for a long moment before she turned, her voice barely audible. "I know this is complicated, but I trust you. Just don't let anyone find out." And with that, she left, leaving Kai alone with a whirlwind of thoughts and feelings. He hadn't expected this, not in a million years. But the seed of understanding had been planted. There was more to Zarian Drax than anyone had ever realized, and maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than he had ever allowed himself to believe. The next few days aboard the Aegis were filled with a tense calm. Kai Sullivan continued his work on the ship's systems, trying to keep his focus on the repairs, despite the growing complexity of the tasks. He still couldn't shake the conversation he'd had with Zarian Drax. The way she had opened up to him, even if only a little, had shifted something inside him. But he refused to let his emotions get in the way. There was still a job to do, and he wasn't about to let anything distract him from it. Zarian, on the other hand, seemed to keep her distance after their late-night talk. She remained professional, maintaining her usual air of control. But there was a subtle change in her demeanor, something softer when their eyes met. Kai wasn't sure if she was still grappling with the weight of her admission, but he didn't press her about it. They had their roles to play, and for now, that was enough. Then came the unexpected crisis. A sudden jolt shook the entire ship, and the alarm systems blared to life. The sound of metal groaning echoed through the corridors, and the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Kai's heart raced as he rushed to the nearest console, quickly assessing the damage. It was bad, very bad. The ship had been hit by a barrage of enemy fire. The Aegis was now drifting in space, vulnerable and damaged. "Damage report." Commander Valora Nethys's voice rang out over the intercom, sharp and commanding. Kai's fingers flew over the console, his mind racing. "Hull breaches in sectors 4 and 7. Main reactor is destabilizing," he reported, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I need a team for repairs immediately." The intercom crackled again. "Sullivan, Drax, report to the weapons control deck. We need to restore our offensive systems. Now." Kay's eyes darted to Zarian, who had appeared in the doorway, her expression one of controlled determination. She was already on her way to the weapons deck before he could even finish processing the command. "Let's go," Zarian said, her voice low but commanding. Kai nodded and followed her, his mind still focused on the repairs that needed to be made. But as they moved through the ship's corridors, the reality of their situation began to settle in. The Aegis was in grave danger. They had no time to waste. When they arrived at the weapons control deck, the sight that met them was far from reassuring. The panel was ablaze with red warnings, and sparks flew from exposed circuits. Zarian wasted no time, her hands moving quickly over the control panels, scanning the data and issuing commands. Her confidence was evident, but Kai knew this was a situation where even the most skilled officers could falter. "We need to stabilize the reactor before we can even think about getting the weapons back online," Kai said, already moving to the nearest diagnostics terminal. Zarian's gaze flicked to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not sure if we have time for that," she said, her voice tense. "We need to act now, or we'll be sitting ducks." Kai knew she was right. They didn't have the luxury of time. "Then we'll have to do both," he said, determination in his voice. "I'll handle the reactor. You focus on getting the weapons back." Without waiting for a response, Kai darted toward the reactor control panel, his mind already calculating the quickest way to stabilize it. Zarian was already at the weapons systems, her fingers dancing over the controls with ease. The air was thick with tension as the two of them worked side by side, each focused on their task, with the fate of the Aegis hanging in the balance. For the first time since their forced partnership, Kai realized that maybe they weren't so different after all. They both had something to prove, and they were both willing to risk everything to save the ship. The hours following the crisis felt like a blur to Kai Sullivan. When the final alarms finally fell silent and the ship's systems stabilized, a deep, exhausted calm washed over him. The Aegis was safe, for now. The weapons were back online, the reactor was stable, and the hull breaches were patched up. But even as he stood in the now quiet weapons control room, Kai couldn't shake the weight of everything that had happened. He looked over at Zarian Drax, who was standing at the far end of the room, her eyes still scanning the data screens as if everything had been business as usual. She didn't seem as shaken as he felt. Her alien composure had never faltered, even in the heat of the moment. But Kai could see the faint traces of tension in her posture, the way her shoulders were just a bit too rigid, the tightness in her jaw. "Good work," Kai said, his voice rough with exhaustion but genuine. Zarian turned to face him, her crimson eyes locking with his. For a moment, there was silence between them. Her gaze softened, just a little, and Kai found himself surprised by the small shift in her expression. It was subtle, but it was there, a flicker of something that resembled appreciation. "Likewise," Zarian replied, her voice as calm as ever, though there was an undertone of something else there. Gratitude. Respect. Maybe. Kai wasn't sure, but he wasn't about to pry. They stood there for a few moments longer, each lost in their own thoughts. The air was still thick with the aftermath of the battle, and the weight of their shared experience hung between them. For a brief second, Kai thought about asking if Zarian was okay, but he held back. What would he even say? They weren't friends, and in some ways, they might never be. But there was a shift between them now, something Kai couldn't quite put into words. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts. Commander Valora Nethys appeared in the doorway, her sharp gaze taking in the scene. She didn't seem surprised that the two of them had managed to stabilize the ship. The Aegis was her responsibility, but she knew that the work they had done was invaluable. "Report," Valora said, her voice firm, but with a hint of relief. Kai quickly ran through the details, recounting the damages, the repairs, and the progress they had made. When he finished, Valora nodded in approval. "Good work, both of you," she said, her gaze lingering on Zarian for just a moment before returning to Kai. "The ship's back on track. I'll be expecting a full report on the systems by tomorrow. In the meantime, take some rest. You've earned it." As the commander turned and walked away, Zarian stood silently beside Kai for a moment. Then, with a subtle smile that seemed almost knowing, she spoke. "Looks like we make a good team after all," she said, her voice lighter than before. Kai glanced at her, a small grin tugging at his lips. "Maybe. But I still prefer working alone." Zarian chuckled softly, the sound surprising him. "I'm not so sure about that," she said, before turning and walking toward the door. "See you tomorrow, engineer." As the door closed behind her, Kai stood there for a moment longer, letting the words hang in the air. Maybe he wasn't so opposed to working with Zarian after all. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they could do this together. The days following the crisis passed in a blur of routine. The Aegis continued its mission, and Kai Sullivan returned to his work, immersed in repairing and maintaining the ship's intricate systems. He worked as he always had, focused, precise, and distant. But there was something different now, something that lingered even in the quiet moments. Zarian Drax was never far from his mind, even when he was elbow-deep in machinery. At first, Kai told himself it was nothing. She was just another officer to deal with, another person he had to tolerate. But as the days went by, he found himself noticing little things. The way she moved with effortless grace. The way her voice had softened just slightly since their last conversation. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him question what was happening. He couldn't stop thinking about her. One evening, as the ship glided through the endless expanse of space, Kai found himself in the mess hall, alone for a change. He was used to the solitude, especially after the stress of repairs and the constant bustle of the ship's routine. He was just beginning to settle into his meal when the sound of boots echoed through the quiet hall. His head snapped up to find Zarian walking in, her usual calm composure unshaken, but something in her expression seemed different. "Mind if I join you?" Zarian asked, her voice smooth as always, but with an undercurrent of something else, something subtle that caught Kai off guard. Kai hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure. It's a free ship." He couldn't help but notice the faint smile that tugged at the corners of her lips as she sat down across from him. For a few moments, there was only the sound of utensils clinking against plates, the hum of the ship's engines in the background. Zarian ate in silence, but Kai could feel her eyes on him. He tried not to let it bother him, but he couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the air between them. There was a strange, unspoken tension, a mix of familiarity and curiosity. Finally, Zarian spoke. "You're different, you know. Most people are intimidated by me, but you don't seem to care." Kai looked up from his meal, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Was she expecting him to be afraid of her? Was she used to men bowing to her presence, letting her beauty and strength take control? Maybe. But Kai wasn't like most people, and he didn't want to be. "I don't know what to say to that," he replied, his tone more thoughtful than he had intended. "I guess I just see you for who you are, not just the alien officer or the intimidating woman." Zarian's eyes softened slightly at his words, though she quickly masked the shift behind her usual confident demeanor. "I suppose that's a refreshing change," she said, her smile returning, though this time it felt genuine. Kai shifted uncomfortably in his seat. What was he doing? Why was he getting drawn into this? He wasn't supposed to get close to her, not like this. He had always kept a distance from others, especially from someone like Zarian. But something about her intrigued him, more than he wanted to admit. As they continued to talk, Kai found himself opening up in ways he hadn't before. Zarian's curiosity about his past was genuine, her questions thoughtful, and despite himself, he found that he was starting to enjoy their conversations. They were far from the lighthearted banter he'd expected, but the connection between them was undeniable. Kai wasn't sure what to make of this new dynamic between them. But one thing was clear, he couldn't ignore it. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure he wanted to. The Aegis had reached a critical point in its journey. After the previous battle and the near disaster they had narrowly avoided, the crew was on high alert. The ship had entered a region of space known for its hostile environment, where pirate ships and enemy factions were known to lurk, waiting for vulnerable targets. Kai Sullivan had no doubt that they would be heading into another dangerous situation, but he wasn't prepared for just how intense things would get. It was late when Commander Valora Nithis called for a briefing. Kai had just finished the day's repairs and was heading back to his quarters when he received the summons. He knew this wasn't going to be a simple task. There was something in Valora's tone that signaled urgency. When he arrived, Zarian Drax was already there, standing beside the commander with her arms crossed. Her eyes glowed softly in the dim light of the room, her posture as commanding as ever. Kai couldn't help but notice the way she seemed to exude confidence even in moments like these, when the stakes were higher than ever. "We're heading into enemy territory," Commander Valora said, cutting straight to the point. "Our mission is to disable a pirate base. It's a vital location for our enemies, and if we can take it out, we'll cripple their supply chain. But it's going to be dangerous. We need everyone on their best." She glanced at Zarian, who gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. Then, Valora's gaze shifted to Kai. We're going to need your expertise, Sullivan. We need to make sure the ship's systems hold up under pressure. And Drax, you'll be leading the infiltration team. Kai felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't just another repair job. It was a high-risk mission, and he would be playing a key role in its success. He had worked alongside Zarian before, but this time, they were venturing into the heart of danger. Everything they had done up until now had been routine. This was something different. Understood, Kai said, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline in his veins. Zarian's crimson eyes locked with his, and for a moment, he saw something shift in them. Something more than just professional focus. There was a hint of something deeper, an unspoken understanding between them that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was the shared experiences, or maybe it was the uncertainty of what lay ahead, but there was a connection between them now, one that neither of them could deny. I'll take the lead on the ground, Zarian continued, her voice low and commanding. Sullivan, you'll keep us on track. I trust you'll have the ship's systems running smoothly. Kai met her gaze, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure how to feel about trusting her like this. But the truth was, they had been working side by side for weeks now, and he had come to realize that Zarian wasn't just an ally. She was someone he could count on, even if he had never fully admitted it to himself. I won't let you down, Kai said, his voice unwavering. He didn't know what the mission would bring, or how it would change things between them, but one thing was clear. The stakes had never been higher. As the meeting ended and the crew prepared for the mission ahead, Kai couldn't shake the feeling that this would be a turning point, not just for the Aegis, but for him and Zarian as well. The danger was real, and the risks were immense. But together, they would face it head-on, and for the first time in a long while, Kai was ready for whatever came next. The Aegis glided through the darkness of space, the quiet hum of its engines a steady reminder of the tension that gripped the ship. Kai Sullivan stood in the ship's control room, his fingers tapping nervously against the console. The mission had begun, and the plan was set. They had entered enemy territory, and the pirate base they were targeting was just ahead. The next few hours would determine everything. Success would mean crippling their enemies, but failure was unthinkable. Zarian Drax was leading the ground team, ready to infiltrate the pirate base and disable their communications and supply lines. She had always exuded confidence, but this time, even she seemed slightly on edge, though she hid it well. Kai knew her better now. She had shared more than just tactical strategies with him in their time together. He had seen her vulnerability, her strength, and the burden she carried. And now, as they prepared for this mission, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Their partnership had evolved from one of mere necessity to something deeper, something that neither of them had expected. Reactor levels are stable, Kai reported as he checked the diagnostics. Shields are holding steady. We're ready for anything, but we'll need to stay on our toes. Good, Commander Valora Nethys said, her voice sharp with command. Keep us in the loop. We'll rely on you to keep the Aegis in fighting shape while Drax's team is on the ground. Kai nodded, his heart still pounding. He was responsible for keeping the ship running smoothly, but his mind kept returning to Zarian. He couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening between them. After all they had been through, it was clear that they had formed an unlikely bond, one built on respect, trust, and maybe even something more. Minutes passed, and soon, the pirate base loomed in front of them. Kai's eyes remained fixed on the holographic display in front of him. Every fiber of his being was focused on making sure nothing went wrong. His fingers moved over the controls, activating the ship's systems, coordinating with the team on the ground, and making adjustments as needed. Drax, we're in position, he called through the communication system. You have a clear path to the base, but stay alert. We're in enemy territory, and I can't guarantee you won't encounter resistance. Zarian's voice crackled through the comm. Understood, Sullivan. We'll be careful. Kai exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the mission settle on his shoulders. This was the moment when everything would change. If they succeeded, they would win a significant victory for their side. But if they failed, he shook his head. Failure wasn't an option, not with Zarian counting on him. Hours later, as the Aegis hovered outside the pirate base, awaiting further orders, Kai received the message he had been waiting for. The mission was a success. The pirate base was crippled, its supplies destroyed, and its communications disabled. Zarian's team had done their job flawlessly. There was no time to celebrate. But as Kai received the transmission from Zarian herself, his heart skipped a beat. "We did it," Zarian said, her voice softer than usual. "Thanks to you, Sullivan." He felt a strange sense of pride, not just in the success of the mission, but in the bond they had forged. They had come a long way since their first awkward meeting. And now, as they sailed back into the safety of space, Kai realized that their partnership was no longer just about survival. It was something more, something that neither of them could have predicted when this all began. As the stars stretched out before them, Kai felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. This was just the beginning. Whatever lay ahead, he knew they would face it together. And for the first time in a long while, he was ready for whatever the universe had in store.